The city was awake, and it was angry. It was a Tuesday morning, which meant the underground station was a river of rushing bodies, a chaotic mix of tired footsteps and impatient sighs. The air down there was thick, smelling of stale coffee, exhaust fumes from the trains above, and the metallic temps of the tracks. Thousands of people were moving through the tiled tunnels, their heads down, their necks bent forward as if they were fighting against a strong wind. Everyone had somewhere to be. Everyone was late. In a place like this, silence was the only thing that didn't exist. There was the constant screeching of metal wheels on rails, the distant, garbled announcements over the loudspeaker, and the overwhelming hum of hundreds of conversations happening all at once, in the middle of this organized chaos. Shoved against a cold concrete pillar near the south exit stood the piano. It wasn't a grand instrument, not something you would see in a concert hall. It was an upright piano, painted a chipping black, with "Play Me, I'm Yours" barely visible on the side in faded yellow letters. To the thousands of commuters walking past, the piano wasn't an instrument. It was furniture. It was an obstacle. It was something to lean a phone on while tying a shoelace. The keys were slightly yellowed. Someone had spilled a sugary drink on the wood near the pedals weeks ago, leaving a sticky, shiny residue that caught the dim station lights. Most days, the piano sat empty, a mute spectator to the rush of human life. A young man in a sharp suit walked by, his briefcase bumping hard against the piano's side as he rushed toward the escalator. He didn't even flinch. He didn't notice the sound. He was too busy shouting into a headset about quarterly projections. A mother dragged a screaming child by the hand, weaving through the crowd, narrowly missing tripping over the piano bench. Her eyes were wide with stress. No one looked at the instrument. No one saw the potential for music hidden inside the dusty wood. To the crowd, it was just another part of the noisy, gray infrastructure of the city. Then, the flow of the crowd seemed to shift, just for a moment. A small gap appeared in the river of people. Through this gap, an elderly woman slowly made her way. She was a stark contrast to the blurred motion around her. While everyone else was sprinting, she was moving at a shuffle. She looked to be in her late 70s or maybe early 80s. She wasn't tall. Her frame was slight and fragile, hunched forward slightly, as if she was carrying something heavy on her shoulders. Her hair was a snowy white, pulled back into a neat but loose bun, and a few stray wisps fluttered against her cheek in the draft from the passing trains. She was dressed simply, in a way that suggested she belonged to a different, gentler time. She wore a long woolen coat that was a deep shade of navy blue, buttons done all the way up to the top, despite the warmth of the station. On her feet were sensible, sturdy black walking shoes with thick soles, the kind designed for comfort rather than fashion. In one hand, she clutched a worn leather purse that looked older than the station itself, and in the other, she held a small paper cup of tea. As she walked, people bumped into her. A young woman texting while walking slammed into the old lady's shoulder, nearly knocking the tea out of her hand. The young woman didn't stop. She just muttered an apology that was swallowed by the noise and kept moving. The elderly woman didn't get angry. She didn't shout. She just stopped, regained her balance with a shaky breath, and took a small, careful sip of her tea. She had a look about her that was incredibly common in big cities, yet almost always ignored the look of someone who had become invisible. She was a background character in the busy movie of everyone else's lives. She paused about 10 feet away from the piano. For a moment, it looked like she was just resting. She leaned heavily against a tiled wall and closed her eyes, exhaling a long, slow breath that seemed to deflate her small frame. She looked exhausted. Her face was a map of wrinkles, each line telling a story of a laugh or a frown from long ago. But then, she opened her eyes, and her gaze locked onto the dusty, black instrument sitting in the corner. It wasn't a hungry look, or an excited look. It was a look of recognition. It was the look of someone seeing an old friend they haven't spoken to in 50 years. The elderly woman pushed herself off the wall and adjusted her grip on her purse. She began to walk toward the piano, navigating the tide of commuters like a small boat in a storm. She moved with a heavy limp, dragging her left leg slightly behind her. Each step seemed to require a conscious effort of will. A group of teenagers, laughing loudly and listening to music through headphones, swarmed around her. They blocked her path, shouting and joking. She waited patiently without a sound until they passed. Then she took the last few steps and stood right in front of the bench. The piano was empty. The bench was there, waiting around her. The station was still a vortex of noise. A train roared into the station on the opposite platform, the wind blowing her coat open. A businessman nearby dropped a stack of papers, scrambling to pick them up while cursing under his breath. A street performer, playing an electric guitar down the hall, was strumming aggressively, competing with the announcements. But the woman didn't hear any of it. She stood there, staring at the keys. Slowly, she reached out a hand. It was a hand that had seen work skin spotted with age, knuckles swollen, veins tracing blue paths beneath the thin paper of her skin. She didn't touch the keys yet. She just rested her hand on the dusty fallboard. Her fingers trembling slightly, she looked around the station, her eyes sweeping over the crowd. She watched a young couple arguing about being late. She watched a tired security guard rubbing his eyes. She watched a student frantically highlighting a textbook. No one was watching her. To them, she was just a tired old lady stopping to sit down. Maybe they thought she was lost. Maybe they thought she was waiting for a ride. No one expected music. No one expected magic. The woman shifted her weight, wincing slightly as her knees cracked. She reached down and carefully placed her leather purse on the dirty floor, tucking it safely under the bench where it wouldn't be kicked. Then, holding onto the piano for support, she lowered herself onto the bench. It was a struggle. It wasn't the graceful sit of a concert pianist taking the stage. It was the slow, cautious movement of someone whose body was no longer cooperating. She shifted her weight, adjusted her coat so it wasn't bunching up behind her, and let out a small sigh of relief to be off her feet. For a long moment, she just sat there. Her feet, in those sturdy black shoes, dangled just slightly above the floor, not quite reaching the pedals yet. She stared at the graffiti scratched into the music rack. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a clean white handkerchief. It seemed like a strange thing to do. The crowd rushed by, wondering why this old lady was just sitting there. Then she leaned forward. With a gentle, motherly care, she began to wipe the keys of the piano. She started in the middle, wiping away the invisible grime of 1,000 strangers' hands. She worked her way slowly to the high notes, then back down to the low notes. She didn't do this because she was OCD or because she was fussy. She did it with a sense of ritual, like she was preparing a sacred space. It was a sign of respect for the instrument. As she wiped the keys, a few people walking by glanced over. It was a curious sight. Most people just walked past the piano or hit it with a fist as they passed. No one ever cleaned it. What is she doing? A young man whispered to his friend as they hurried past, not stopping to hear the answer. I think she's just resting. The friend shrugged, and they were gone, swallowed by the crowd. The woman finished cleaning. She folded the handkerchief neatly and returned it to her pocket. She took another deep breath, her chest rising and falling slowly beneath the wool coat. She straightened her back as much as she could, lifting her chin. Her face changed. The exhaustion, the confusion, the frailty, it all seemed to drop away, replaced by a sudden, intense focus. Her eyes, which had been watery and distant a moment ago, sharpened. She wasn't an old lady in a subway station anymore. She was a musician at her instrument. She raised her hands. They hovered over the keys, trembling slightly, but then steadied. The air around the piano seemed to stand still, even as the commuters continued their frantic rush just inches away. The noise of the station, the trains, the announcements, the shouting seemed to fade into the background for just a few square feet of space. The woman closed her eyes for a brief second, listening to a melody that only she could hear. The station was loud, rude, and indifferent. But she was about to change all that. She was about to speak the only language she knew could cut through the noise. She flexed her fingers, feeling the cold plastic of the keys beneath her fingertips. Then she lowered her hands. The rush hour was at its peak. The crowd was thickest. The noise was deafening, but no one was paying attention. They were just asking for a simple distraction. They wanted something to break the boredom, or they expected nothing at all. As her fingers finally made contact with the keys, the first notes were about to ring out, cutting through the stale air of the underground, ready to stop the world, even if just for a moment. She was ready to play. The subway station was still a river of rushing people, but around the piano the current was starting to slow. It wasn't a stop, not yet. It was more like an obstacle in a stream that created a small, swirling eddy. People were forced to walk around the bench where the elderly woman sat, and this slight inconvenience caused them to look up from their phones or their thoughts for a brief second. They saw an old woman in a wool coat sitting at a dusty instrument, and in their minds, they instantly categorized her. She was just another part of the city's strange scenery, like a broken turnstile or a flickering light. A few feet away, a group of young people had paused their frantic march. They were dressed in the fashion of the day-trendy sneakers, oversized jackets, and expensive headphones resting around their necks. They were probably students on their way to class, or perhaps friends heading to a coffee shop to hang out. They represented the loud, fast energy of the city. One of them, a tall young man holding a skateboard, nudged his friend with his elbow and pointed a finger toward the corner. "Check this out," he said, his voice carrying a mix of amusement and curiosity. "We've got a concert." His friends laughed, but it wasn't a mean laugh. It was the laugh of people who were bored and looking for anything to break the monotony of the morning commute. They turned to look. The sight of the elderly woman, with her white hair and sensible shoes, huddled over the piano, seemed funny to them. It was an odd contrast. The station was gray, loud, and metallic, and she looked like a grandmother who had wandered out of a garden tea party.
"Oh, lady,"
one of the girls in the group shouted out. She was smiling, her bright phone screen already glowing in her hand. "Are you a professional?" The woman didn't turn around. She didn't flinch. She just kept her hands resting lightly on the keys, her back straight, her focus entirely inward. The group took her silence as a cue to keep going. They weren't trying to be cruel. In their minds, they were being friendly. They were interacting with the local color. To them, the piano wasn't a serious instrument. It was a toy, a prop for street performers or bored travelers. "Play something for us," another voice chimed in. This time, it was a businessman in a gray trench coat who had stopped to tie a shoe. He stood up, balancing on one foot while fiddling with his laces, and looked over at her with a grin. "Yeah, give us a tune. Wake us up a bit." More people began to drift over. It is a strange thing about crowds. If a few people stop, everyone else wants to know what is happening. It is the fear of missing out. Within a minute, a semicircle had formed around the piano. It wasn't a huge crowd, maybe 10 or 15 people, but in a station where everyone usually ignores everyone else, it was a gathering. They were standing at a safe distance, watching her like an animal in a zoo, waiting to see what she would do.
"Hi, do you know chopsticks?"
The boy with the skateboard asked loudly. A few people in the crowd snickered. It was the classic joke. If you see a public piano, you ask for chopsticks. It is the oldest, simplest tune everyone knows. It was a test. They expected her to fumble. They expected her to play a few clumsy notes, maybe laugh, and then shuffle away. Someone else echoed, or heart and soul. Everyone knows that one. The requests flew at her like small paper airplanes. "Play something happy. Play us a pop song. Do you know the Beatles?" The atmosphere was light, buzzing with low-energy excitement. The crowd was relaxed. They were entertained by the novelty of it. Here was this sweet-looking old lady, about to provide them with 30 seconds of free entertainment before they went back to their stressful lives. Several people pulled out their phones. They held them up, their screens recording the gray-haired figure at the piano. They weren't recording because they expected to hear something beautiful. They were recording so they could send a snap or a text to their friends saying, "Look at this crazy lady playing the piano at the station." The woman on the bench shifted slightly. She heard them, of course. Her hearing might have been old, but it was sharp enough to catch the laughter in their voices. She understood exactly what they were thinking. They saw a frail old woman. They saw a joke. They saw a simple, harmless distraction. They didn't see the 70 years of life she had lived. They didn't see the hands that had once played in grand halls. or the fingers that had once danced across ivory keys for royalty. They just saw a grandmother. She didn't turn to face them. She didn't try to correct them. She didn't say, "I am not a clown." She simply nodded her head, just once. It was a small, barely perceptible movement. It was a nod of acceptance. She accepted them for who they were, crowd-aboard strangers, and she accepted the moment for what it was. If they wanted a tune, she would give them one. But it would not be the tune they expected. She reached down with her right foot and found the gold sustain pedal. It was sticky and stiff from lack of use, probably rusted slightly on the inside. She pressed it down experimentally, then lifted it up, feeling the resistance. It was a feeling she knew intimately. It was like shaking hands with an old companion. "Okay, here we go," the skateboard boy said, nudging his friend again. "Get ready to record." The woman flexed her fingers. She stretched them wide, one by one. First the thumb, then the index finger, all the way to the pinky. Her joints were swollen, her skin thin, but the movement was precise. It was the movement of a surgeon preparing for an operation or a martial artist preparing for a fight. The crowd, watching her hands, stopped giggling for a split second. There was something about the way she held her hands hovering just inches above the keys, perfectly still, that didn't match the image of a confused grandmother. It looked professional. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the dusty station air. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat, clearing her mind of the noise, of the trains, of the rude teenagers, of the cold. She went to a place inside herself where the music lived. She remembered the feeling of sunlight on a different stage, a long time ago. She remembered the smell of polish and the silence of a respectful audience. The crowd leaned in. The man with the briefcase stopped checking his watch. The girl with the phone zoomed in her camera lens. "Come on," someone whispered impatiently. "Play it." The woman opened her eyes. The sadness was still there, deep in the wrinkles around her eyes, but it was mixed with a sudden, fierce fire. She was no longer the invisible old lady. She was the conductor of this moment. She lowered her hands. For a second, there was total silence. Even the train on the opposite track seemed to fade away. The only sound was the hum of the station lights. The anticipation hung heavy in the air. The crowd was smiling, waiting for the plinking. Clumsy notes of chopsticks. They were ready to laugh, to clap politely, and to walk away. But then, her fingers touched the keys. She didn't start with the silly two-note rhythm of chopsticks. She didn't start with the familiar bouncing melody of heart and soul. Instead, she struck a chord. It was a deep, resonant C minor chord, but she played it softly, gently, letting the notes bleed into one another. It wasn't a thump. It was a sigh. The sound that came out of that battered, dusty piano was impossible. It shouldn't have sounded that way. The instrument was cheap, broken, and abused. But under her touch, the wood seemed to wake up. The vibration rattled through the bench, through the floor, and into the feet of the people standing nearby. The teenage girl holding the phone lowered her arm slightly, her eyebrows drawing together in confusion. The man with the skateboard stopped leaning against the pillar and stood up straight. The businessman dropped his shoelace, forgotten on the dirty floor. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't a simple tune. This was something else entirely. The woman hadn't even played a melody yet, but with that single chord, she had grabbed the attention of everyone within earshot and demanded that they listen. She had accepted their challenge to play a tune, but she was about to show them that simple did not mean small. She was about to tear down the walls of their indifference with nothing but 2 hands and 88 keys. The music was sweeping them away. The grimy subway station, the smell of exhaust, the stress of the workday had all dissolved. There was only the sound. And the sound was telling a story. It was a story without words, but everyone understood it. It was a story of love and loss, of youth and age, of the fleeting nature of time. It was a story that the woman had been carrying inside her for a lifetime, and she was finally letting it out. She was turning her pain into something beautiful, giving it as a gift to a crowd of strangers who had asked her for a simple tune. The music was sweeping them away. The grimy subway station, the smell of exhaust, the stress of the workday, it all dissolved. There was only the sound. And the sound was telling a story. It was a story without words, but everyone understood it. It was a story of love and loss, of youth and age, of the fleeting nature of time. It was a story that the woman had been carrying inside her for a lifetime, and she was finally letting it out. She was turning her pain into something beautiful, giving it as a gift to a crowd of strangers who had asked her for a simple tune. The music was no longer just sound. It had become a living, breathing entity that filled the cold, tiled station. The old woman was playing with a ferocity that defied her frail appearance. Her body swayed back and forth, her coat flapping slightly with the intensity of her movement. The melody she had started with, that gentle, questioning tune, was gone now. In its place was a storm of sound. She was playing a piece that felt like a conversation between a lover and a memory, full of longing, sharp pain, and a deep, aching beauty. The crowd that had gathered was no longer a loose collection of commuters waiting for a train. They had transformed into an audience, though not a single ticket had been sold. The circle around the piano had tightened. People were standing shoulder to shoulder, pressing in to get closer to the source of the sound. There was a strange kind of magic happening here. In a city where people usually went to great lengths to avoid eye contact, where headphones were a shield against the world, everyone was facing the same direction. Everyone was focused on the same thing. The volume of the music grew. The cheap piano, which had been abused by years of indifferent weather and rough hands, was singing. The vibrations rattled the change in the woman's purse. Sitting on the floor, and they rattled the chests of the people standing nearby. A man in a construction worker's helmet, covered in drywall, dust, and grime, stood with his mouth slightly open. He had big, rough hands, hands that were used to gripping hammers and lifting heavy beams. But as he watched the woman's delicate, arthritic fingers fly across the keys, he looked down at his own palms. He suddenly remembered being a little boy, sitting at his grandmother's kitchen table while she peeled apples and hummed a tune that sounded just like this. His eyes, stinging from the dry dust and the sudden rush of emotion, began to water. The woman on the bench did not see the construction worker. She did not see anyone. Her eyes were squeezed shut, her face tilted upward, toward the harsh fluorescent lights of the station ceiling. A single tear broke free from the corner of her eye and traced a slow path down her cheek, cutting through the powder on her face. It wasn't a tear of sadness exactly. It was a tear of release. She was pouring 70 years of life into this instrument. Every heartbreak she had ever endured, every love she had ever lost, every moment of joy and every second of sorrow, it was all flowing out of her fingertips and into the music. The teenage boy with the skateboard was still there. He had put his phone away completely, which was a miracle for someone his age. He stood with his arms crossed over his chest, a defensive posture that he couldn't quite maintain. His face, usually set in a mask of teenage cool and boredom, had crumbled. He looked confused. He didn't understand classical music. He didn't know the composer or the history of the piece, but he understood the language of emotion. The music was telling him something that words never could. It was telling him that it was okay to feel things. It was telling him that even old people, people he usually ignored on the subway, felt things just as deeply as he did. He swallowed hard, trying to push down the lump that had formed in his throat, but it wouldn't go away. The music shifted again. It became softer, more delicate. The notes were like drops of rain falling on a quiet pond. The woman's hands slowed down. She was playing a section that required incredible control. The sound was barely a whisper now, yet it commanded the station even more than when she was playing loudly. The silence between the notes was heavy. You could hear the electricity humming in the lights overhead. You could hear the shuffling of feet, but no one spoke. They were afraid that if they made a noise, the spell would break. They were afraid that the music would stop, and they would have to go back to being strangers in a rush. A young woman in a business suit, clutching a portfolio to her chest like a shield, was weeping openly. She didn't care about her makeup or who saw her. She had just come from a terrible meeting where her boss had humiliated her in front of her colleagues. She had been walking to the platform feeling small, worthless, and defeated. But listening to the old woman play, something shifted. The music was so powerful, so full of dignity and grace, despite the woman's age and the shabby environment. It made the young woman feel like her own problems were small, but also that she had the strength to survive them. The music was a bridge between her own pain and the pain of the stranger at the piano. It was a reminder that suffering was universal, but so was beauty. The old woman's left hand began a repetitive, rhythmic bass line. Thump thump, like a heartbeat. Over the top of this steady pulse, her right hand wove a melody that was so high and so sweet, it felt like it might float up to the sky and escape. The underground station entirely. It was a sound of pure hope. It was the sound of the sun coming out after a week of rain. People in the crowd who had been frowning, stressed, and angry began to relax. Their shoulders dropped. They exhaled. The collective tension of the morning rush hour dissipated. Evaporated by the music, the crowd was experiencing something that psychologists call collective effervescence, a shared sense of emotion that ripples through a group of people. But here, it was quiet. It was a silent communion. 50, maybe 60 people, from all walks of life, united by a feeling. They weren't thinking about their jobs, their rent, or their destination. They were just feeling. They were human beings, witnessing another human being exposing her soul. It was a gift. The woman's face was a landscape of emotion. Her mouth would tighten when the music became difficult, then relax into a soft smile when the melody resolved. It was as if she was having a conversation with the ghosts of her past. Perhaps she was remembering a husband who had passed away years ago. Perhaps she was remembering a child she had once held in her arms. Perhaps she was remembering the person she used to be when she was young and full of dreams. The piano was her time machine. The boy with the skateboard looked at the elderly woman's hands. They moved so fast, hitting the keys with precision that seemed impossible for someone her age. He realized with a jolt of shock that she must have been playing for her entire life. She must have practiced for thousands of hours. And here she was in a dirty subway station giving away her talent for free to a bunch of strangers who just wanted to hear chopsticks. He felt a sudden wave of shame for his earlier arrogance. He felt unworthy of the performance, yet grateful that he was there to witness it. The music began to climb again. It was building toward the final section. The rhythm sped up. The chords became thicker, richer, more complex. The sound was massive now, filling the entire concourse. It wasn't just a piano anymore. It was an orchestra. The notes crashed over the crowd like ocean waves. The teenager found himself holding his breath. The businesswoman was wiping her eyes with a crumpled tissue. The construction worker had taken off his helmet and was holding it against his chest. His head bowed. This was the climax. This was the moment the woman had been waiting for. She was playing with every ounce of energy she had left. You could see the strain in her neck, the sweat on her forehead. She was giving everything she had. It was a display of raw, unfiltered humanity. In a world that was becoming increasingly digital and artificial, this was 100% real. There were no backing tracks, no auto-tune, no filters. Just wood, wire, flesh, and bone. The emotion in the air was palpable. You could almost reach out and touch it. It was thick and heavy. People were crying, but they weren't sobbing. It was a quiet weeping, a cleansing weeping. They were crying for the woman, they were crying for themselves. They were crying for the beauty of the world that they often forgot to see. The noise of the city, the trains, the announcements, the traffic was completely gone. The only thing that existed was this music. It was a bubble of pure emotion in the middle of the chaos. The woman hit a series of high-running notes that cascaded down the keyboard like waterfalls of diamonds. The sound was piercingly beautiful. It cut through everyone's defenses. The young man with the phone finally put it in his pocket, realizing that no recording could ever capture this feeling. You had to be here. You had to breathe the same air. She was approaching the end now. The intensity was at its peak. The crowd was on the edge of a collective cliff. The woman's face was lifted towards the lights. Tears streaming freely now, but her expression was one of absolute triumph. She had conquered the room. She had conquered the indifference of the crowd. She had turned a request for a simple tune into a life-altering experience. She wasn't just playing a song. She was telling them that they were alive, and that feeling pain was the price of being alive. And she was telling them it was worth it. The music rushed toward the final chord like a train approaching the station.
Oh, bud.
There was no crash, only a glorious, soaring arrival. Her hands flew to the high end of the keyboard and then crashed down in a thunderous, resonant finale that seemed to shake the foundations of the earth. The sound echoed, bounced off the walls, and then slowly began to fade. The woman held her hands on the keys, pressing them down, letting the vibration linger until there was nothing left but silence. Silence, and the sound of 60 people trying to catch their breath. The final chord seemed to hang in the air forever, vibrating against the tiled walls of the station, refusing to die away. It was a massive, resonant sound that felt like it had shaken the dust loose from the ceiling. The woman's hands were still pressed down on the keys. Her white-knuckled grip, the only sign of the immense physical effort she had just exerted. Her chest was heaving slightly, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. But she kept her head bowed, and then she slowly lifted her hands. The sound stopped. The silence that followed was not the ordinary silence of a subway station. It was heavy. It was thick. It was the kind of silence that falls over a room when something truly profound has just happened. It was as if the station had been holding its breath along with the music, and now it was afraid to let it out. The screech of a distant train, the hum of the vending machine, the murmur of the escalators, all of it seemed to be sucked into a vacuum, leaving nothing but the ringing in the ears of the 50 or 60 people standing in the semi-dash circle. No one moved. No one spoke. For perhaps 10 or 15 seconds, time stood completely still. The teenage boy with the skateboard stood with his mouth open, his arms dangling uselessly at his sides. The businessman had forgotten his briefcase entirely, leaving it on the dirty floor behind him. The construction worker took off his cap and held it over his heart, a gesture of automatic, deep respect. They all stared at the small, hunched figure on the bench. They were looking at her, but they were also looking through her, trying to understand where that music had come from. How could so much sound, so much pain, and so much beauty come out of one person? Then a soft sound broke the spell. It was the sniveling of the young mother near the back. She was wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, unable to stop the tears. That sound seemed to wake everyone up. It was like a starting gun. From the other side of the crowd, a man slowly started to clap. It wasn't a polite clap. It was a slow, rhythmic thud of palm against palm. Clap, clap, clap. A second later, another person joined in. Then a third. Within moments, the applause exploded. It wasn't a scattered applause. It was a wave of sound that crashed over the station. It was a roar of appreciation, a collective scream of thank you from the hearts of strangers. People were whistling, shouting bravo, an encore. Some were clapping so hard their hands were stinging. The woman on the bench flinched slightly, as if the noise was too loud after the beautiful music. But she didn't turn around. The applause was deafening, louder than the trains, louder than the city noise. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated connection between the performer and the audience. These were people who would never see each other again, people who had nothing in common except that they had been in the same place at the same time to witness a miracle. But for that moment, they were a family. They were united by the tears drying on their cheeks and the music still echoing in their souls. Slowly, the woman stood up. It was a difficult process. Her knees were stiff and her back was sore. She groaned quietly, a sound of age and fatigue, as she pushed herself up from the bench. The applause didn't stop. If anything, it got louder as she rose. The crowd was cheering not just for the music, but for her, for the courage it took to sit there, pour her heart out. She reached down to the floor and retrieved her worn leather purse. She dusted off the coat, smoothing the fabric over her hips with trembling hands. Then she turned to face the crowd. The look on her face was not one of pride or vanity. She wasn't smiling like a celebrity accepting an award. She looked shy. She looked surprised. She blinked her watery eyes and looked out at the sea of faces staring at her. It was as if she had just woken up from a trance and was surprised to find so many people there. She gave a small, modest nod. It wasn't a bow. It was a simple acknowledgement. "You are welcome," the nod said. "I see you." The crowd surged forward slightly. The spell was broken, and now people wanted to touch her, to talk to her, to thank her. The teenage boy stepped forward, pushing his skateboard under his arm. He looked taller now, less like a kid and more like a young man. He started, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat, embarrassed. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." "What was that song?" "Who are you?" Others chimed in. "Ma'am, you play like an angel." "Are you a professional?" "You have to play more." "Do you have a CD we can buy?" The questions swirled around her like a vortex. People were holding out their phones, wanting to record her face, wanting to capture her name. They wanted to own a piece of the magic she had created. The business executive was frantically searching his wallet for money, trying to thrust a $20 bill at her. "Please, take this. You earned it. You really earned it." The woman looked at the money, then at the outstretched phones, and then at the eager faces. A gentle, sad smile touched her lips. She shook her head slowly. She reached out a hand and gently pushed the money back toward the executive. She held up a hand to the boy with the phone, signaling him to stop recording. She spoke for the first time. Her voice was raspy, thin, and quiet, but it carried a surprising weight. "It was just a simple tune," she said. Her words were simple, but the meaning behind them was heavy. Just a memory. She didn't give her name. She didn't explain the music. She didn't accept the money. She didn't want to be a star. She didn't want to be a viral video on the internet. She had given them the music, and that was enough. The transaction was complete. She had shared her soul, and now she wanted it back. She adjusted the strap of her purse on her shoulder. She looked at the crowd one last time, and for a second, her eyes twinkled. She saw the impact she had made. She saw the tears, the smiles, the softened faces. She saw that she had changed the atmosphere of the station, even if just for 10 minutes. "Thank you for listening," she whispered. Then she turned around. A miracle happened. The crowd, which had been pushing and shoving just minutes ago, parted like the Red Sea. They moved back, creating a wide, clear path for her. No one blocked her way. No one bumped into her. They stepped aside with reverence, treating her like royalty. She walked slowly, her limp more pronounced now that the adrenaline was fading. The heavy shoes clacked on the concrete floor. Asterisk, clack, drag, clack. Asterisk, as she walked through the tunnel of people, they didn't cheer anymore. They watched in silence. A few people reached out as she passed, not to grab her, just to brush her sleeve or touch her shoulder, as if confirming she was real. The young mother mouthed a silent thank you with tears streaming down her face. The construction worker stood with his head bowed. The teenage boy just watched, a look of awe and wonder permanently etched onto his face. She didn't look back. She kept her eyes forward, focused on the exit sign glowing red in the distance. She was leaving the stage, returning to her life. Perhaps she was going home to a quiet, empty room. Perhaps she was going to a hospital appointment. Perhaps she was just going to sit on a park bench and watch the birds. No one knew. She reached the escalator and stepped onto the moving metal stairs. As she slowly ascended, rising up toward the street level, the crowd below watched her shrinking figure. The distance grew between them. The magic started to fade. The subway station was just a subway station again. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The announcer's voice came over the PA system, garbled and loud, announcing the next train. The spell was broken. The crowd began to disperse. The mood was strange. No one rushed immediately. People looked at each other, making brief eye contact before looking away, embarrassed by their shared vulnerability. They picked up their briefcases, their skateboards, their shopping bags, but they walked differently. Their steps were a little lighter. The scowls were gone from their faces. The boy with the skateboard picked up his board, but he didn't ride it. He walked slowly, thinking about the music. He realized he had judged the woman by her cover, and he had been completely wrong. He made a silent promise to himself to look for the beauty in things, to not always assume the worst. The business executive picked up his briefcase and straightened his tie. He decided that he wouldn't go to the office and yell at his employees today. He decided he would call his mother, whom he hadn't spoken to in 3 months. The young mother wheeled the stroller toward the train, humming a soft, sad melody she didn't know the name of. She felt stronger. She felt capable. Up on the street, the city roared. Cars honked, sirens wailed, and people shouted. It was the same chaotic world as before. The elderly woman stepped out onto the sidewalk and took a deep breath of the fresh air. She looked left, then right. She merged into the flow of pedestrians on the sidewalk. Within seconds, she was just another gray figure in the crowd, invisible again. Down below, the piano sat empty on the platform. It was just a dusty, chipped box of wood and wires. But if you walked past it and listened closely, if you really paid attention, you could almost still hear the ghost of the melody. You could almost feel the tears. The simple tune was over. The crowd had to go back to their lives, but none of them would ever forget that morning. None of them would forget the lesson taught to them by a stranger with white hair and a wool coat, that beauty can be found anywhere. Even in the dirtiest, busiest places, if you are just willing to stop and listen. And sometimes, most profound things come from the people you expect the least from. The train pulled into the station. The doors hissed open, and the river of people rushed on. But the station felt different. It felt a little less cold, a little less gray, because for a few minutes it had been filled with the sound of a human heart.